Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you for everyone who's turned up this evening. I've long been a fan of Romancing the Gothic, and I love the Saturday and Sunday talks. So it's great to finally get a chance to contribute to this. Um, I'm speaking here today with my academic hat on as Sophie Sawicka-Sykes, but if you want to find me on social media, the best way to do that is to search my pen name, which is Severa Adamovich, and I've got a couple of links there on the slide. It's a little bit easier to spell and pronounce, so that's the main reason I use that name. I've also got some fiction and creative nonfiction published under that name. So I'll be talking to you today about demonic anti-music and its dissonant resoundings in the Middle Ages and also in the modern day. And we're going to go right back to the late ancient period with Athanasius of Alexandria, but I'm going to ease you in by talking about a more recent example, maybe something you're a bit more familiar with. So you may know the work of Hieronymus Bosch. This is the middle panel from his Temptations of St. Anthony triptych. And as you can see, the hermit saint is in the middle of the picture there, looking out towards the viewer in an attitude of prayer. We've got Christ in a chapel at the back here. So I'm going to explain a bit more about Anthony later on in the talk, but all you need to know for now is that he was a 4th century pioneer of desert monasticism in Egypt. And he was, throughout his ascetic career, assailed by demonic attacks. So there's a lot going on around the edge of this picture, but I want to focus in on the musical figures. So here's Anthony, as I explained, kneeling down in prayer. And just to his left, we have this pig-headed man carrying a lute, and then a beggar behind him with a demonic tail, shouldering a hurdy-gurdy. And they're making their way over to a table which is full of gamblers and drinkers. And then on the other side, we've got this rather, I think, quite cute-looking bird demon, which has a shawm for its nose, and it's the ancestor. Shawm is the ancestor of an oboe. It has quite a high-pitched sound, and it's breathing out what looks like infernal smoke. So he's already getting assailed by the sounds of the shawm there, and potentially also the sounds from these stringed instruments by the other two figures. But at the bottom of the picture, there's also more going on. So coming out of this rotting red fruit, we have this rider with a horse's skull for a head, playing a harp. And on the other side of the river, between them, we have a demonic choir reading from a liturgical book. And if that wasn't enough for poor Anthony, we've even originally at the back of the picture, instead of the chapel with Christ praying, there was even more of a kind of demonic cluster. And so, as you can see, we've got this monstrous figure, again with a shawm nose, and it's carrying a lute. So he'd have been assaulted from the back as well. And there has been quite a bit written on music and hellish music in Hieronymus Bosch paintings because it comes up in quite a few of his works. But quite a lot of the scholarly attention seems to be on the Garden of Earthly Delights triptych. It might be something that you're familiar with, maybe. This is a detail from the right panel, and it shows hell with musicians being tortured on their own instruments. There's some very interesting work that's freely available online by Ian Pittaway, Early Music Muse, and he analyzes this picture in a lot of detail, as well as looking at the context of other Hieronymus Bosch works, and concludes that Hieronymus Bosch really had something against secular musicians and saw them as providing fleshly temptation and luring you away from the sacred. Similar things have been said by Walter S. Gibson. So he writes regarding the Garden of Earthly Delights, in Bosch's infernal concert, this enticing music of the flesh has changed to harsh discords, mingled with the cries of the damned, who are punished by the very means which brought them pleasure during life. So he very much associates this with the sin of lust, which Ian Pittaway does as well, among other sins. But I think there alternative ways of reading these images, and I think particularly for the Temptations of St. Anthony, we could interpret the painting as drawing on a much earlier stream of ideas that can be found in the very earliest text of the life of St. Anthony, that of anti-music as a weapon in a demon's arsenal, designed to create distraction and fear that can lead the soul into spiritual disorder. So I'm going to take you through a few different sections. We've started off with Bosch's triptych. The next two sections are based on a paper that I wrote that was published back in 2017 in a volume called Demons and Illness. And I'm going to look at harmony on the micro and macro scales, so on the small and large scales in Athanasian theology. And Athanasius is also the author of the Life of Antony, and we're going to look at how those ideas of harmony are kind of turned on their head and how we get demonic anti-music trying to disrupt harmonious relations. I'm then going to go on to briefly talk about some echoes of the life of St. Anthony in a medieval saint's life, the life of Guthlac, and finally end with a modern example of anti-music in The Boogeyman from 2023. So Athanasius of Alexandria, who wrote the Life of Antony, was quite a character. He's an early theologian, Christian theologian. He was also deacon and pope. He may have known Egyptian monks like Antony because he spent part of his life actually hiding from the imperial police. He ended up falling out with quite a lot of people during his life. He had orthodox views regarding the oneness of God, which some Christian sects disagreed with at the time. And when he lost his supporter in imperial court and a new emperor came in, he was exiled. And that happened 5 times. He was exiled 5 times in total. So he actually formed quite close relations with the hermits who were out in the desert and the early monks. And he wrote his Life of Antony while he was on one of his exiles. It became a big hit and was translated into Latin by Evagrius around the mid-370s. And from there, it went into the Latin medieval West. And earlier on in his career, Athanasius composed a text called Against the Heathen, in which he outlines the errors of the pagans and tries to direct his readers towards this orthodox idea of the oneness of God, the idea that the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are all one entity. The Son is not subordinate to the Father in any way. And in that text, a bit of background that would kind of help you towards understanding it is that he believed that pagans turned away from God because they became embroiled in the world of the senses, and they also developed a fear of death based on their kind of materialistic outlook. And that allowed demons to get a hold of them and trick them into thinking that idols were actually gods. So he's responding to those sorts of concerns. And in order to make his argument, he uses musical allegories and analogies. So he's talking here about order within the soul and using this idea of the lyre, the instrument that you can see in the background of the slide. So he writes, "For as the strings of the lyre have each its proper note, high, low, and intermediate, sharp or otherwise, yet their scale is indistinguishable, and their time not to be recognized without the artist. For then only is the scale manifest and the time right, when he that is holding the lyre strikes the strings and touches each in tune. In like manner, the senses being disposed in the body like a lyre, when the skilled intelligence presides over them, then too the soul distinguishes and knows what it is doing and how it is acting." So here he's talking about the importance of reason. In the soul, reason is the thing that brings all the senses together. Without reason, you end up being embroiled in this world of sensory perception, which then skews your idea of how the universe works. And I think it's particularly telling he's using this idea of the lyre, this idea of right relation, proportion, harmony between different parts of the soul. And he's very much indebted in his thinking to Stoic philosophers who believe that passions can throw out the balance of a soul. So in order to have a well-ordered soul, you've got to have the reason and the right judgment presiding over everything. He also extends this to the kind of macro level and shows that God is present in the universe from what we can see around us. So he says it's possible to attain the knowledge of God from the things which are seen in creation. Creation declares, as if with a loud voice, by its order and harmony, its taxeos and harmonias, its own Lord and Creator. So we see consonance and harmony around us. And the way he imagines that is the universe is full of contraries, hot, cold, dark, light, different elements, but they're all held in checks and balances. And if there wasn't a skilled intelligence presiding over all these, we wouldn't have an ordered universe, we'd have a disordered one. There would not be arrangement, but anarchy, not a system, but everything out of system, not proportion, but disproportion. But that's not what we have, according to him. Everywhere there is order, proportion, arrangement, everything is harmonious. So therefore, there must be something that produces that harmony and keeps it all like that. He then uses another musical analogy to illustrate this. In fact, he uses several, but I want to go back to this one about the lyre. So just as he used the lyre as an analogy for the soul being held in balance and order, he does that with the cosmos as well. So he says the order of the whole universe being perfectly harmonious, there being no strife. That is very similar to if you hear a musician playing a lyre and all the notes are kind of sounding well together. He also uses a musical analogy of a choir. So says that the diverse voices, the different things we find in the universe are all directed by one choir master. He also talks about Christ as holding a lyre and therefore bringing together things of heaven and things of earth. So this is the result of, seeing the universe with a sense of reason, holding your passions in check. But what happens when your carefully relations are upset? If individuals were to become fearful and look away from the oneness of God and fail to attend to divine order, their ability to perceive the cosmos would be severely impaired. They would see chaos instead of order. Their soul would be led into a sickened state of ataxis, so disorder. And the noisy demons in the life of Antony attack by precisely these sorts of means. I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Antony, spelt without an H, because that's how Athanasius does it. So according to Athanasius, Antony is a rich young man. His parents have died and they've left him a lot of land. And he goes to church and hears a sermon one day about Jesus giving away his possessions and decides this is what he wants to do. So he sends his sister off to a nunnery and gives away all his land to the poor and decides to pursue a life of ascesis. So self-denial, spiritual training. He really reduces his diet. So he's living off bread and water and eating maybe once a day if he's lucky. He stays up all night performing vigils. He lives in solitude or relative solitude. So first off, he apprentices himself to a solitary man in a nearby village. This is not quite enough for him. So he decides the next best thing to do is to go to a tomb and live inside a tomb. And he does that. But even then, that's not good enough for Antony. So he goes into the desert, which is where not many ascetics have been before. And according to Athanasius, he really is the pioneer or founder of desert monasticism. So after Antony, once his name becomes known, then more people go off to live in the desert in monasteries. But he lives alone in an abandoned military fortress for 20 years, according to this author. When he gets quite famous, he's then pestered by quite a lot of people who are possessed by demons, etc. Decides this is too much, and he goes to the inner mountain, which is a very, very isolated part of Egypt. Maybe Mount Colzum, that's one place that it could be. There's a monastery of St. Anthony there in the present day. So at every point of his ascetic career, he is tormented by demons. And in the middle of the life of Antony, there is this very long piece of rhetoric, which is also a really great explanation on how to discern different spirits. And he gives a sermon to his monks, and he tells them how they can discern, how can they tell apart a demon from an angel. And he says everything demons do, they talk, they cause mass confusion, thorobusi, they pretend to be others than themselves, and they create disturbances. All this for the deception of the simple. They make crashing sounds, they laugh madly and hiss. So this is mostly described in terms of sound, and that this word thorobusi, different forms of that keep coming up in the life. And then from his, quite early stage as a spiritual fighter, he actually addresses the demons and says, since the Lord has broken your strength, you attempt to terrify me by any means with a mob. So the word mob is kind of interesting there because throughout the life, it's a big group of demons that are tormenting him, mostly a big group of demons. And even when people come to visit him, so for example, in the desert, some of his followers decide to stand outside this fortress where he's sealed himself. And they hear what sound like clamoring mobs, Thorobuntun, making noises, emitting pitiful sounds and crying out. And the demons there are actually crying out because they want him to leave the desert. They're saying, this is our land. Why are you trying to take it from us? And he describes this in his speech as the sort of noise you might expect from tough youths or robbers. Indeed, he's actually physically assaulted by demons as well. So people who come to his cell on the inner mountain hear the sound like the sound of weapons. And that is because at various points, it does say that the demons attack him with instruments and he is physically hurt by this. He's in agony at some points. And in case you think this is just a result of there being lots of demons, so, they're a group, of course, they're going to be noisy. Even Satan, just by himself, noisily disturbs Antony. So at the very earliest point of his ascetic career, Satan pays him a visit, and he also has this disturbance that comes with him. This word that's come up quite a few times in various forms, thorubos in Greek. So it can mean a noise, especially of a crowd, so an uproar or a clamor. Also, the kind of state that comes about as a result of that noise, so confusion, trouble. And I think what's particularly interesting is that it's a species of fear, according to the Stoics. So the Stoics were very keen on putting all the emotions and passions into taxonomies. So they have lots of different types of fear, and one of them is thorubos. It's panic, which is fear. This translation's a bit dodgy. Fear with pressure exercised by sound. But what that means is like the approaching sound of a mob would fill you with panic. And so it's more than just noise, like it's also the effect that goes with noise. And it has a really significant effect on the soul of the monk who hears this as well. So Antony explains in his speech, from these noisy disturbances come terror of the soul, confusion and disorder of thoughts, ataxia, dejection, enmity towards ascetics, listlessness, grief, memory of relatives, and fear of death. And finally, there is craving for evil, contempt for virtue, and instability of character. So it sort of mirrors humanity's fall away from God, in that you have this turning away from the order of creation and from the oneness of God, and paying attention instead to the kind of sensory realm, which then causes disorder. It radiates out from the individual monk as well. So they begin to affect the community around them, enmity towards ascetics. They no longer want to be part of this community striving towards God. So one type of anti-music, this idea of going against an order, creating disorder, is this unstructured noise. And a good article to kind of compare this analysis to is by Richard Rastall. He's talking about late medieval plays in this article, The Sounds of Hell. And one of the things he comes up with is this unstructured noise. The other categories of the sounds of hell or agents of Satan, maybe not so much used in the life of Antony, maybe a little bit the deceit position, but liturgical parodies do also come up. So he says frequently, without becoming visible, they pretend to chant with sacred songs. So the demons aren't actually chanting. And we can make a distinction. I think Joseph Dyer, the musicologist, makes a distinction between monks who actually pray with their tongue and their mind, and they're concentrating and meditating on the word of God, and it's meaningful. Whereas demonic chanting is just imitation, it's mimicry. And Anthony states that the intention behind the trickery is to bring the simple to despair, to declare the discipline useless, to make men sick of the solitary life as something burdensome and very oppressive, and to trip up the leaders of the communities. So there is this kind of dejection and listlessness again. Maybe the idea is the monks might not be able to tell the difference between a demon chanting and sacred chant. And so they think, what's the point? Maybe they can't tell the difference, and the demon then sinks its claws into them and is able to do what it wants with them. So they completely turn off the idea of an eremitic life. But yeah, again, it's something that affects the whole community and not just the individual soul. There is, however, a way around this. So throughout the life of Antony, the saint is able to ward off these demons and battle against them using psalm singing. And the reason why this is effective is explored in a different text by Athanasius called A Letter to Marcellinus, in which he interprets the book of the Psalms. And he says that when reason governs the body's members and passions, man becomes a stringed instrument and devotes himself completely to the spirit and serves the will of God. And he says the harmonious reading of the Psalms is a figure and type of such undisturbed and calm equanimity of thoughts. That which is disturbing and rough and disorderly in it is smoothed away, and that which causes grief is healed when we sing the Psalms. So you've got to approach the Psalms with a reasoned mind or reasoned soul in the first place. But once you do, then you're able to use the Psalms, which are harmonizing melody and words. You can use that to change all those discords within your own soul and to bring yourself back to God. It's also interesting in the life how the demon's power comes from the fact that they're appearing in a group and they're causing all this noisy disturbance and actually even physically attacking. But Antony also turns that on its head and says, well, the reason why they have to come in a group is because they don't actually have power. Christ has already defeated them. And there's a really beautiful bit in another text called On the Incarnation, where he talks about Christ's crucifix being raised up into the air, and that sort of cleansing the air of the demons who inhabit the middle space between earth and heaven. So these ideas were transmitted into the medieval West through a translation by Evagrius, Latin translation. And I'm just going to talk about one example from the Middle Ages that uses these sorts of ideas very directly. So this is the life of St. Guthlac. It was written by Felix in the early 8th century. And Guthlac is really the Antony of the Fens. So he takes himself off into Crowland, the fens around Crowland, which is a pretty scary place, to be honest, even more than the desert, especially these days. But when Guthlac was alive, it was also fearsome because of the demons that hung out there. So he finds a barrow, which is like a burial mound, a pagan burial mound, and this is full of demons. And he goes off, and just like Antony, when he went into the tomb or when he went into the fortress, he lives his ascetic life there and battles against the demons. And there are various episodes of him being attacked by demons. At one point, it quotes or pretty much paraphrases or slightly changes, but essentially copies Evagrius's translation of the life of Antony, talking about the shape of these wild animals that come to attack him. The grunting of the boar, the howling of the wolf, the whinnying of the horse, the belling of the stag, the hissing of the serpent, the lowing of the ox, the croaking of the raven, made harsh and horrible noises to trouble the true soldier of the true God. And I think it's really interesting there that the author, Felix, is drawing out that it is the noise that is troubling him. It's supposed to be distracting. It's supposed to distract him away from his prayer and from his ascesis. It's supposed to cause him fear. But he does have his defenses, and St. Bartholomew intervenes very directly. So when Guthlac is carried off by demons to the mouth of hell, as we can see in this lovely illustration from the Guthlac roll, St. Bartholomew appears, and he actually is able to tell the demons to take Guthlac back to his original cell, and they obey him. And as Guthlac is being taken back through the air, the sound of angels singing can be heard, and they're singing Psalm 84. The saints shall go from strength to strength. So Guthlac himself prays, but he's also we also know that the saints and angels are on his side through this holy music that he hears as well. So that's just a really quick excursion into the Middle Ages. I'm going to go on to a modern example now. So The Boogeyman came out 2023. It's based on a short story by Stephen King, but it is very different to the short story. And I think one of the best things about this film is its soundscape. There's some really creepy noises all the way through the film, and it blends into the musical score really nicely. Well, or not nicely, as the case may be. But the story here is that we've got a grieving family. The two sisters are really traumatized by the death of their mother, and their father, who is a therapist, ironically can't help himself. He can't actually talk about this with his children. And because of this wound in the family, the boogeyman latches onto them and tries to terrify them with an ultimate aim of taking the girls and killing them. So it's, like I said, very effective soundscape. The presence of the boogeyman is indicated by rustling and growling and snarling. So very animalistic noises, and also loud bangs that give you a jump scare. It also can imperfectly imitate the human voice. So there's a very, very good bit where the older sister is in the basement. She's watching a video of her mother singing this lullaby to her as a baby. And the mother's like, oh, don't video me. I've got a terrible voice. And then a few minutes later, we hear the echo of that by the boogeyman saying, I have a terrible voice. But it means terrible and causing terror, causing fear. And I'm going to show you a clip from the film which illustrates this. So I'm just going to stop my screen share. So as you hopefully heard in that clip, we've got the boogeyman imitating that song, which is supposed to be comforting. It's supposed to be a way of healing the broken relations between the family members after the death of this mother. It's a way of bringing the little sister out of that state of fear and calming her down. But it's been completely twisted by the boogeyman. So the reason for this is because the boogeyman likes to scare. It wants to cause fear. Another character in the film says it likes to play with its prey, and kind of makes the prey more delicious if they're more afraid. It feeds off the grief and trauma that already exists within the family. The grief and trauma makes the family susceptible, and the boogeyman needs the dark to stay hidden, not just the literal dark of a closet or being under the bed, but also the spiritual, psychological dark of being in a state of grief and trauma. So it creates fear and panic and disorder that perpetuates the disturbances in the mind. So the imitation is all part of that. It can use imitation to fool and deceive the characters into thinking someone else is talking, but very quickly it becomes clear that it's primarily doing it to scare. So I mean, it's not exactly like the life of Anthony. Obviously, it's a secular film. It's not to do with you know, finding God in an ordered universe, but it nevertheless is about moving away from a model of health and harmony towards disorder and spiritual or even mental illness. And in fact, therapy is a recurring theme in this film. So the point of therapy is to, in this film, but also in life, is to create connections between people to allow healing. And there's a lot of talking therapy scenes that the girls are involved with. But the boogeyman is a foil to this. It doesn't want its victims to move on. It wants to keep them in a childlike state of fear. And there's an interesting scene at the end of the film where they, spoiler, try and kill the boogeyman, which has set its den up in their basement. And they find that it's built this network out of people's fear and suffering. And when they burn it, all these voices come out, and they're all voices of pain and anguish. So that is what the anti-therapy of the boogeyman relies on. That's what it nests in. That's what it feeds on. And that's very inimical to this idea of therapy that runs parallel to that in the film. And so finally, we come back to Hieronymus Bosch and the temptations of St. Anthony. So we can see here that the demons surrounding Anthony are distracting, they are causing disharmony, and they're also possibly there to create the sense of fear. But one question we can raise with this painting is, how far is Anthony actually distracted by this? He's choosing to look away from the sights around him, but he can't close his ears off, surely. And is he looking away? Is he looking towards us as the viewer in a state of contemplation? Is he beseeching us to pray? Or is he actually getting distracted? He's not looking towards the chapel where Christ is, after all. So do we succumb as well as the viewer to this kind of disorder? Because our eyes are drawn away from him if we even see him among all this disorder. And we're going to these very colorful figures at the periphery of the picture. We go towards the chaos. So even though it's a silent picture, we can easily imagine the discordant twanglings of that demonic harp, the snorts of the lutenist and the screeches, the terrible voices that all go towards creating disorder and disharmony. Thank you for listening. I've got a couple of slides here with references. So the primary sources are all on here. And the secondary sources, if you're interested in following this topic up in more detail, are all on that final slide. And the slideshow will be available, obviously, because it's being recorded. So if you wanted to look in more detail, you'll be able to find that at a later date. But thank you very much for listening, and don't have nightmares.